It was a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where the air felt heavy with the promise of something waiting just beyond the horizon. I arrived at Mr. Donovan's house early, as usual. My boss had asked me to keep an eye on things while he was out of town for the week, a trip he often made to handle some high-profile business deal overseas. It wasn't unusual for him to rely on me. I had worked for him for years, starting as an intern and gradually earning his trust. Mr. Donovan was a powerful man, sharp, confident, and the kind of guy who always seemed to know what he wanted. His wife, Sophie, was just as impressive. She was younger than him by a decade, elegant and poised in that effortless way that drew people to her. I'd seen her at office parties and the occasional dinner, always the perfect hostess, but we'd never spoken much beyond polite greetings. I admired her from a distance, like everyone else did. That morning, though, I felt something different in the air. Sophie had asked me to stop by and help with a few things around the house while her husband was away, and I, of course, agreed without hesitation. She was my boss's wife, after all. How could I say no? When I knocked on the door, she answered almost immediately, dressed in a casual but flattering outfit that accentuated her natural beauty. Her hair was loosely tied up, strands framing her face in a way that made her look softer, more approachable than usual. "Come on in," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "Thanks for helping out. I didn't want to bother you, but there are a few things I could use a hand with." "No problem at all," I replied, stepping inside. The house was immaculate, as always, tastefully decorated, everything in its place. It felt comfortable but distant, like a showroom of someone's perfect life. The thought crossed my mind that it must get lonely in a place like this, especially with Mr. Donovan always traveling. She led me to the living room, where she had laid out some paperwork. "I know this isn't exactly your job, but could you help me with some of this? It's just some bills and a few things I'm trying to organize." "Of course," I said, sitting down beside her. I couldn't help but notice the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and intoxicating. She smiled at me, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of ease, as though this wasn't just another task for my boss. There was something personal about it, something unspoken. As we worked through the papers, our conversation flowed easily, naturally. She asked me about work, about my life, and I found myself opening up more than I expected. It was so easy to talk to her, to get lost in the rhythm of our conversation. Every now and then, her hand would brush against mine as she handed me a document, and each time, I felt a jolt of awareness run through me. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was imagining things. She was just being kind, friendly. There was no reason to think anything more of it. But then, there was the way her eyes lingered on mine a little too long, the way she would smile in that soft, knowing way, like she was fully aware of the effect she had on me. It wasn't until we were nearly finished with the paperwork that she sighed and leaned back against the couch, her expression shifting. "It gets a little lonely here, you know? With him gone so much." I glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "I can imagine. It must be hard." She nodded, her eyes distant for a moment before she looked back at me. "It is. But you'd get used to it after a while." There was a pause, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. "I just wish he didn't have to leave so often." The vulnerability in her voice took me by surprise. She wasn't just the perfect wife standing beside the powerful businessman. She was human, with her own emotions and struggles. I felt a strange urge to comfort her, to say something that would ease the sadness I saw in her eyes. "You're not alone," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I mean, I'm here if you need anything." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like the room around us had disappeared. There was a tension in the air now, a pull that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. She didn't say anything, just smiled again, but this time, it wasn't the polite smile of before. It was something warmer, something that made my heart race in my chest. We finished up the paperwork, and I stood to leave, but as I reached the door, she called out to me. "Wait." I turned to face her, and she was standing there, just a few steps away from me, her expression conflicted. There's something else I need help with, she said, her voice quieter now, more intimate. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how close we were. What is it? She hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer. Could you stay a little longer? I could use the company. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I knew what she was asking, and I knew it wasn't just about company. There was something deeper, something we both felt but hadn't admitted. My mind screamed at me to leave, to walk away before things went too far. But my body was rooted to the spot, drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. I started to speak, but she silenced me with a look, her eyes soft but intense. Please, she whispered, and that was all it took. I nodded, my throat tight. Okay. She smiled again, that same warm, inviting smile that had first drawn me in. But now, there was something different about it. Something dangerous. Sophie led me back into the living room, her steps slow, deliberate, as though she was giving me time to back out. But I didn't. I couldn't. The air between us felt charged, each breath heavy with anticipation. She moved gracefully, her fingers brushing the back of the couch as she walked, and I followed her, unsure of what would happen next, but unable to turn away. She sat down on the couch and patted the space beside her. Sit with me? She asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I hesitated for only a moment before sitting down, careful to leave some space between us. But that distance didn't matter. There was an invisible thread pulling us closer, one that neither of us seemed able to resist. For a few moments, we sat in silence, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall the only thing breaking the stillness. I tried to think of something to say, something that would bring us back to safer ground, but nothing came to mind. All I could think about was her closeness, the warmth of her presence, the way her gaze seemed to see right through me. I didn't mean to put you in an awkward position, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just, I don't know who else to talk to. I feel like no one really understands. Her confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words, the weight of the situation. She was trusting me, opening up to me in a way that felt deeply personal. And that trust only made the tension between us even more palpable. You can talk to me, I said softly, surprising even myself with the tenderness in my voice. I'm here. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. There was something unreadable in her gaze, something that made my heart beat faster. Thank you, she whispered. Then, after a pause, she added, It's been a long time since I felt close to someone. Really close. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew that this was the moment where everything could change. I could feel the pull, the undeniable chemistry that had been simmering beneath the surface since I walked into that house. And now, it was bubbling to the surface, impossible to ignore. Sophie, I began, my voice trailing off as I struggled to find the right words. But she didn't let me finish. Instead, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on my arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I glanced down at her hand, then back up at her, my pulse quickening. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable, she said softly, her fingers brushing against my skin. But I can't help the way I feel. Her confession made my breath catch in my throat. This was real. It wasn't just in my head. She felt it too, the attraction, the tension. It was mutual, and it was growing stronger by the second. I started, but the words died in my throat as she moved closer, closing the small distance between us. Before I knew what was happening, her lips were on mine, soft and hesitant at first, as though she was testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us came rushing to the surface. I kissed her back, my hand instinctively reaching up to cradle the back of her neck. The warmth of her skin against mine, the softness of her lips, it was intoxicating. I felt like I was losing myself in her, in the moment, in the flood of emotions that had been building for days, weeks. But then, reality hit me like a cold wave. This was Sophie, my boss's wife. I was crossing a line I knew I couldn't uncross. I pulled back, breaking the kiss, my breath ragged. "We can't do this," I said, my voice shaky with the weight of what had just happened. Sophie stared at me, her lips slightly parted, her eyes filled with confusion and desire. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to stop." Her admission sent a surge of conflicting emotions through me. Part of me wanted to give in, to let myself be swept away by the moment. But another part of me, the part that knew the consequences of what we were doing, was screaming at me to stop, to walk away before it was too late. "We have to," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "This isn't right. He's my boss." Sophie sighed, her hand still resting on my arm. "I know," she said quietly. "But he's never here. He's always gone. And I've been so lonely." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a pang of empathy for her. I could see the loneliness in her eyes, the sadness that she had been carrying beneath her composed exterior. She wasn't just the elegant, confident woman I had always seen her as. She was human, vulnerable, and in that moment, I realized just how much she had been hiding. "I don't want to make things harder for you," she said, her voice soft. "But I can't deny how I feel. And I think you feel it too." She was right. I couldn't deny it. The attraction between us was undeniable, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it kept pulling me back in. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's gaze softened, and she moved closer again, her hands sliding down to take mine. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," she said gently. "Let's just take it one step at a time." Her words were soothing, but they didn't ease the knot of guilt that was tightening in my chest. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from wanting her. The pull was too strong, too intense. Before I could say anything else, Sophie leaned in again, her lips brushing mine in a kiss that was softer this time, more tender. And this time, I didn't pull away. We lost ourselves in that kiss, in the overwhelming intensity of the moment. I didn't think about the consequences, about what this would mean for the future. All I could think about was her warmth, her touch, the way she made me feel like nothing else mattered but the two of us. But as the kiss deepened, I knew that we had already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The kiss lingered, deepening with every second, and with it, the weight of what we were doing seemed to dissolve into the background. The sensation of her lips on mine, the warmth of her body so close, it felt like everything else had faded away, leaving just us in this moment. Sophie's hand slid up to my chest, her touch light but filled with intention, and I could feel my body reacting to her in ways I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. But reality was never far behind. As much as I wanted to lose myself in her, in this forbidden moment, the guilt gnawed at the edges of my mind. This was wrong. She was my boss's wife. Every logical part of me screamed that I had to stop this before it went any further, before we crossed a line that could never be repaired. But the other part of me, the part that had been drawn to her from the start, was louder, drowning out the logic with the need that pulsed between us. Sophie pulled back just slightly, her lips hovering close to mine, her breath warm against my skin. Her eyes were filled with a mix of desire and uncertainty, mirroring the conflict swirling inside me. "I don't want to make things difficult for you," she whispered, her voice so soft, I barely heard her. "But I can't ignore this. I can't ignore how I feel when I'm with you." Her words sent a fresh surge of emotion through me. The vulnerability in her voice, the honesty, it broke through my defenses in a way I hadn't expected. I was torn between the growing intensity of my feelings for her and the weight of the consequences that loomed just beyond this moment. "We shouldn't be doing this," I said, my voice thick with emotion, even as my hand reached up to gently brush a strand of her hair behind her ear. It's wrong." Sophie nodded, but her eyes never left mine. "I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But sometimes, what feels right and what's right aren't the same thing." Her gaze held me captive, and I could feel the truth of her words sinking in. She leaned closer again, her lips brushing against the corner of my mouth, and it sent a shiver through me. "I just don't want to feel so alone anymore," she whispered, barely audible. Those words, "I don't want to feel alone anymore," they hit me harder than I expected. I knew what that kind of loneliness felt like, the kind that crept in when you least expected it, and made even the brightest moments feel dim. Sophie wasn't just someone's wife, someone living in a perfect house with a perfect life. She was a person, a woman who had needs, desires, and a deep ache that had gone unnoticed for too long. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to tell her that I felt the same pull, the same undeniable connection that had been simmering between us since I'd walked into her house. Instead, I kissed her again, more urgently this time, pouring all of my conflicted feelings into that kiss. This time, there was no hesitation. Sophie responded with the same intensity, her body pressing closer to mine, her hands sliding up to rest against my chest. The heat between us grew, and soon we were moving in sync, lost in the moment, lost in each other. I felt her fingers tug at the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer still, as if she couldn't stand the distance between us for another second. Everything else disappeared. The world outside, the responsibilities, the consequences, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way her touch ignited something inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I wanted was her, and I could feel that she wanted the same. We tumbled onto the couch, our bodies entwined as the kiss deepened, as our hands explored each other with a hunger that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Her breath hitched as my lips found the curve of her neck, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against my chest. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the reality of the situation crashed back into focus. Sophie pulled away first, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. She sat up, running a hand through her hair as she tried to collect herself. I sat there beside her, my own heart racing, the weight of what we had just done settling over me like a heavy fog. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, charged with the intensity of everything that had just happened and everything we both knew it meant. "We shouldn't have done that," I said finally, my voice hoarse with emotion. I don't know what I was thinking." Sophie didn't look at me right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, twisting them together in her lap. "You weren't the only one who wanted it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I knew what I was doing too." I sighed, leaning back against the couch as the full weight of the situation settled over me. "But what now? Where does this leave us?" Sophie finally looked at me then, her eyes filled with the same mix of confusion and guilt that I felt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what happens next." There was a part of me that wanted to offer her some kind of reassurance, to tell her that everything would be okay, that we could figure this out. But I couldn't. The truth was, I had no idea what would happen next, and the uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on my chest. "We can't keep doing this," I said, even as my heart ached at the thought of pulling away from her. "It's not fair to him. It's not fair to anyone." Sophie nodded, biting her lip as she looked down again. "I know," she whispered. "But I don't regret it. I don't regret feeling close to you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I didn't know how to respond. I didn't regret it either. But that didn't make it right. For what felt like hours, we sat there in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts, in the tangled mess of emotions that had been unleashed between us. I didn't know how to move forward, and I didn't know if I had the strength to walk away. But in the end, I knew what I had to do. "I should go," I said finally, my voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Sophie looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness but also understanding. She didn't try to stop me, didn't try to convince me to stay. Instead, she simply nodded. "Okay," she whispered. I stood up, the air between us thick with the unresolved tension that still lingered. I wanted to say something else, something to make this easier, but there were no words that could fix what had happened. So instead, I walked toward the door, my heart heavy with everything I was leaving behind. As I reached the door, I paused, turning back to look at her one last time. Sophie was still sitting on the couch, her eyes downcast, her hands folded in her lap. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and it tore at my heart. "Sophie," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. What could I possibly say that would make this right? She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Goodbye," she whispered. And with that, I walked out of the house, leaving behind the woman who had made me feel things I hadn't thought possible, and the situation that had changed everything. But even as I walked away, I knew that this wasn't the end. The feelings that had been stirred between us, the connection we had forged, they weren't going to disappear overnight. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I was doing the right thing, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really the end, or just the beginning of something far more complicated. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, guilt, and longing. I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would help me forget the events of that night, the way Sophie had looked at me, the way her touch had ignited something inside me that I couldn't seem to shake. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I was at the office, every email or message from Mr. Donovan made my stomach twist with guilt. I couldn't look him in the eye without the weight of what had happened with Sophie pressing down on my chest. And yet, even with that guilt, the desire to see her again lingered, as if some part of me was still tethered to her, drawn back to that night, to the moment we had shared. A week passed before I saw Sophie again. I had tried to avoid it, but Mr. Donovan had called me over to the house to go over some work files. I could feel the tension building as I pulled up to the driveway, my heart racing at the thought of seeing her. I wasn't sure what I would say, how I would act, or if I even had the strength to face her after everything that had happened. Mr. Donovan greeted me at the door, his usual sharp, businesslike demeanor in place as always. He was in a hurry, briefcase in hand, ready to head to yet another business meeting. "Just grab the files from my office," he said, glancing at his watch. "I'm running late, but Sophie should be home if you need anything." His words made my chest tighten. The thought of being alone with her again sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. But I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral as I headed inside. As soon as I stepped through the door, I felt the familiar weight of tension settle over me. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that felt heavy, charged with the unresolved feelings that lingered between us. I made my way to the office, hoping to grab the files quickly and leave before anything could happen. But as I stepped into the room, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned, and there she was, Sophie, standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with the same mix of emotions I had seen the last time we were together. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her hands clasped together, as if she was trying to decide what to do, what to say. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I was frozen. Seeing her again brought everything rushing back, the kiss, the way we had lost ourselves in each other, the guilt and confusion that had followed. "Sophie," I began, my voice barely audible. She stepped into the room, her gaze never leaving mine. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I thought, after that night, you wouldn't come back." I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to fit. "I didn't know what to do," I admitted. "I didn't want to make things worse." Sophie moved closer, her expression conflicted. "I know it's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been trying so hard to forget, to convince myself that what had happened between us was just a moment of weakness. But hearing her say it, that she felt the same way, that she was struggling with it too, made everything so much more complicated. "I've been thinking about it too," I said quietly, my throat tight. "But we can't keep doing this." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. "But that doesn't make it any easier." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the air between us heavy with everything that had gone unsaid. I could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain that I had been feeling ever since that night. We both knew what we had to do, but the connection between us was too strong to simply ignore. Finally, Sophie spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I've been so alone," she said, her words filled with raw vulnerability. "And you made me feel alive again. I don't know how to just walk away from that." Her confession made my chest ache, and I felt the same pull that had drawn me to her before. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but I knew that wasn't true. Nothing about this situation was okay. "I care about you," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "But this isn't right. He's my boss, and we can't keep doing this." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But then she took a deep breath and nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "We can't." I could feel the tension between us building, the emotions swirling just beneath the surface. But I knew I couldn't give in. Not again. "We need to stop," I said, my voice shaking. "For both of us." Sophie wiped away a tear, her expression a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I don't want to lose you," she said softly. "But I know you're right." We stood there for a moment longer, the weight of our decision settling over us like a heavy fog. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that we had to let go, no matter how much it hurt. "I'll miss you," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "I'll miss you too," I admitted. And with that I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the woman who had changed everything. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me, and I felt the full weight of what I was leaving behind. It wasn't just Sophie. It was the connection we had shared, the way she had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't expected. But it was over. It had to be. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself back into work, trying to bury the memories of that night, of Sophie, of the kiss that had changed everything. Mr. Donovan never suspected a thing, and I did my best to pretend that everything was normal. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. I didn't see Sophie again. She kept her distance, and so did I. It was better that way, cleaner, less painful. But even as the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the moments we had shared, the connection that had pulled us together despite everything. Maybe, in time, the memories would fade. Maybe I would be able to move on, to forget the way her touch had felt, the way her eyes had looked at me with such raw vulnerability. But deep down, I knew that a part of me would always carry that night with me, the night when we had crossed a line that could never be undone. And as much as I tried to move forward, the memory of Sophie, and the way she had made me feel, would linger, a quiet ache that would never fully go away.